Hi, I'm Eric Rabkin, Arthur F. Thurnau Professor, Professor of English Language and Literature, and Professor of Art and Design at the University of Michigan. It was terrific to hear from so many of my former students. Thank you for your questions. Now let's turn to some of them. Rosalind Pahaski wants to know if America's gradual turn towards secularism, away from religion, is one of the reasons for the obsession of supernaturalism, vampires, and werewolves these days. Well, supernaturalism is a term I'm not sure I entirely understand, because some people think of UFOs as supernatural, they think of ESP as supernatural. It's a much wider category than vampires and werewolves. But vampires and werewolves have a special place. They help us think about who we are, what it means to be a person, and what kind of social structure we sit within. In general, vampires represent aristocrats, and werewolves represent the working class. You can see the difference in their origins. The vampire, think of Bela Lugosi in the famous Dracula movie, the vampire is high class. He has a castle. He's alone, and he lords it over, physically over, in that high castle, the people around him. The werewolf runs through the forest. The vampire consciously becomes whatever he wants to be in order to drink the life of the unsuspecting masses around him. The werewolf has no choice. But both share this aspect of the supernatural. They convince us by their existence that there are really forces beyond us. Therefore, both of them in different ways finally reassure us. Nicole asked, when did vampires first appear in literature? And do I have any thoughts on what may have inspired them? The ancient Greeks talked about lamia, and these lamia were demons that lived by sucking the life out of innocent people. Probably this was based on an even older legend of a beautiful queen of Libya known as Lamia, who became a child-eating demon. You can see all the way back then that in one sense the fear is the fear of the other. To the Greeks, the Libyans were the other. Beauty is dangerous because it seduces us to do things we may not want to do. There is a confluence of the question of life and its destruction and sexuality in the earliest vampires. And to this day, as we see in the Twilight series, vampires are very sexy symbols. Throughout, vampires arise when we realize that we are tempted to do what we shouldn't. For example, enter into illicit sexual relations. And we want to externalize that fear and push it away. Brian Hall writes to say that we are using the fantastical to connect with God at a time when so many no longer rely upon religion for this role. That question suggests that one does believe that there is God. Otherwise, how can one connect with him? And I don't want to comment on that. But whether one thinks of this as connecting with God or connecting with the idea of God, it certainly is true that people do want to make such connections. Once upon a time, when you couldn't achieve poetic justice in a work of art, God would come down from the machinery of the theater and settle everyone's affairs in an appropriate way. That God from the machine was known as a deus ex machina. We have come to think that a deus ex machina is a kind of cheap trick on the part of the playwright or the novelist. A critic observed that in the 19th century, think of books by Dickens, for example, when people couldn't be expected to rely on the God coming down from the machine to settle things, coincidence took the place of God. Carl Jung wrote a book about flying saucers, in which he said that people saw these things because they wanted to believe there were higher powers that were concerned with our well-being. Robert Planck wrote a book called The Emotional Significance of Imaginary Beings, in which he suggests that all imaginary beings somehow stand in for that superego, that voice of the internal parent that tells us what we should do. And frankly, sometimes we don't want to do what that parent says. So if we see that parent as a monster rather than a just God, we are justified in rejecting him. Adrian and Kelly ask about the role of fantasy and imagination in education and in a child's world. That is, in fact, a crucial question. In fact, there is, it turns out, a universal structure for fairy tales in every culture, even those that have had no earlier contact with Western culture. The fairy tale situation begins with absentation. The child is separated from the parent by wandering into the woods, by disobeying, by the parent dying perhaps. But what happens in the fairy tale is the recuperation of a sense that one can face the dangers of the world one is growing into and succeed. In fact, every child does this, whether or not the child is using fairy tales. How many children play with dolls and have them enact the situations that they observe adults to participate in? Imagination is our defense against the fears we see coming over our horizons. And it's the proving ground in which we develop those skills to be able to meet those things. But more importantly, for the progress of humanity, imagination is where we try out things that never existed before. So that if we, as a species, will make real progress, not just have individual children get older successfully, we must foster imagination. It is essential to education. Thank you so much for your questions. Stay tuned for another edition of Ask M.